Welcome back. We're very thrilled that everybody's here. This is a fabulous turnout today. We are very grateful for everybody who's here, members, friends of the forum, corporate sponsors, of course, at MSTS. We have two speakers in the room, and then John Woodworth is joining us from Virginia. Year of Living Dangerously. How many remember the movie? Indonesia. Ironic that I picked the topic, and now we're giving the presentation the week after Indonesia just voted in yet another military dictatorship. We're in the year of living dangerously this year. This is a really challenging year of topics to go through. Normally, we would have our two esteemed speakers here, Keith and Ray, and they would be talking about things like national security strategy, nuclear posture reviews, and all the important things that under relatively normal times administrations do. And we report out to you so you can follow these issues. But we got together as we were planning this meeting, and I said, oh, this is like way too complicated to just talk about policy doctrine right now, because it was moving so fast from when we started the preparations to this talk to getting to this point. Things have changed real time. So what we agreed to was that they would take on giving a whirlwind tour of the hot issues that you need to have on your radar screen as you go through 2024, and give you some thoughts about what are some of the key points to think about. You're not going to get nitty-gritty details on any given topic this time. However, these are topics, any one of which could be an NSF program. Feel free to suggest which ones you really want us to dig into in the course of this year. Keith, I think you're up first.
Thank you, Maureen. And it's a privilege to kick this off this morning with an overview. These are the three categories of issues we've come up with. What we want to do on these is go through these three issues. Ray will take the Middle East, John will take the Ukraine, Russia, NATO, and Maureen will take the southern border. Keep in mind that there are many countries out there nipping at our heels. So a lot of what we're talking about now could come up, and even though it's not today's hot issue, it might be tomorrow, if not this afternoon. And unfortunately, countries and some non-state actors are seeking to take advantage of our weaknesses, perceived or real. That's the world we live in. I'm going to turn it over to Ray, and he can walk you through the latest of our exciting adventures in the Middle East.
Thank you, Keith. We'll turn to the Middle East. Any discussion of what's going on today really has to start with the situation a century ago. So I will give you a very brief, mile-high historical overview in preparation for some of the additional comments. Palestine before World War I was an Ottoman Empire province that had a large Arab but small Jewish and Christian communities. Early in the 20th century, young Zionists like David Ben-Gurion fled ghettos and violence in Europe to establish a Jewish home and haven in the land of the Hebrew Bible. After the war, the Ottoman Empire was dismantled. In 1920, the League of Nations granted to Britain a mandate to administer Palestine, which contained a commitment to establish a national home for Jews, the result of lobbying by Zionist organizations, but failed to mention any right of Palestinian sovereignty or self-determination. As the writer Arthur Koestler put it, one nation solemnly promised to a second nation the country of a third. And this planted the seeds of conflict. In 1929, Palestinians rebelled over land rights and control of the Temple Mount. The Reed Commission of 1936, in order to address constant unrest, proposed a plan of partition, which the Palestinians rejected. Later, the Holocaust of World War II drove thousands of Jews to seek safe haven in Palestine. In 1947, the United Nations also recommended a two-state partition plan. At this point, much of the world felt that it owed Jews a debt because of the Holocaust, but Palestinians never believed that they were required to pay it. At the time of partition, there were 600,000 Jews and twice as many Palestinians who rejected the plan and turned again to violence. In the 1947-48 war that followed, there was a massive expulsion of Arab refugees, and wars have occurred ever since. So let's turn to today's events between Israel and Hamas. The next slide shows you the geographic layout of Israel, the Palestinian West Bank, and Gaza, as well as the most immediate policy issues. We've got Israel, West Bank, and Gaza. The axis of resistance, comprising Iran and its proxy militias, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and elements in Syria, has long worked to force the U.S. out of the Middle East and to eradicate the state of Israel. Iran provides arms and training for these proxies, which supposedly work independently, giving Iran plausible denial to escape responsibility for proxy attacks. The timing of the Hamas attack took place against the backdrop of political progress in the region, following the Abraham Accords in September 2020. Sunni Arab nations were moving gradually to recognize Israel and to normalize relations. Palestinian leaders feared this would strengthen Israel and eclipse the Palestinian quest for statehood. On October 7th, Hamas struck Israel with savagery, killing over 1,200 people and seizing 240 hostages. Hamas fighters then withdrew to the extensive tunnel system in Gaza to fight the next stage of the war. Israel mobilized some 300,000 troops to fight an estimated 30 to 40,000 Hamas fighters. Next slide gives you an overview of the tunnel system, now estimated to extend some 350 to 450 miles beneath the most densely populated areas of Gaza. On this map, you can see the heavily populated areas, and you can see the tunnel structures, or at least what was known of the tunnel structures, underneath those heavily populated areas. This system has some 5,700 shafts that exit through homes, shops, hospitals, and public buildings to allow fighters to set up ambushes or to escape. To get at the fighters in the tunnel system, the Israeli military has killed over 28,000 Palestinians, including some 4,000 children, destroyed or damaged 70% of the housing in Gaza, displaced 80% of the population of 2.2 million, and put 40% of the residents at risk of famine. The Israeli military campaign focused most heavily on a two-pronged thrust into Gaza City in the north and Khan Yunis in the south. The Israelis report that the Hamas headquarters is in the tunnels northeast of Khan Yunis. Recently, the campaign has focused on al-Bureij in the middle of the Gaza after the discovery of additional tunnels. The final phase of the campaign is aimed at Rafah, where the Israelis seek to destroy the last 4 of the 24 Hamas battalions and deny the last haven for Hamas to reorganize and rearm. The next slide gives you an idea of the sophisticated construction that went into the tunnels. There are small tunnels to move fighters and protect them, but this large tunnel can accommodate vehicles, move missiles, and allow the transport of food and ammunition. The Hamas strategy of hiding behind civilians and fighting from tunnels has so far been successful. There's widespread condemnation of the destructiveness of the Israeli military campaign. Israel has been accused of genocide. There are international demands for a ceasefire, but there's been little mention of the Hamas massacre that initiated hostilities. It has been said that how the war ends depends on who is in charge. Several Sunni countries have indicated that they would be willing to normalize relations with Israel, but both Saudi Arabia and Egypt have insisted they will not engage Israel without guarantees of a post-war plan for Palestine. That means some form of a two-state solution with moderate governance. As a result of past wars, however, Israel has conquered additional territory, much of which is now occupied by Israeli settlers. A two-state solution would involve vacating some of this territory. Recently, Prime Minister Netanyahu rejected calls for Palestinian sovereignty and called for Israeli security control over all territory west of Jordan. This is, he said, contrary to a Palestinian state. Others in Israel are more forthcoming, but they are not in power. There is no statehood solution in sight. There is no permanent ceasefire in sight. De-escalation of the combat operations, however, is likely in the face of U.S. and international pressure. Indeed, civilian casualties have dropped significantly during the last 2 months. I think it is possible, as time passes, the tunnels are neutralized, and international pressure mounts, that Israel might allow surviving Hamas fighters to leave Gaza for Lebanon or another destination and rely on assassinations to deal with disposing of the Hamas leader. And that's already started. As of mid-February, about 2/3 of Hamas fighters are estimated to have been killed or wounded, and most of the Hamas battalions destroyed. De-escalation would allow humanitarian aid to enter the occupied zone, but it leaves 1.5 million people displaced and the geostrategic situation in limbo. Meanwhile, the U.S. and other countries are trying to prevent a wider war while the axis of resistance is promoting it. Currently, it is touch and go, but failing to contain this war has large and lasting political consequences for the U.S. and most of its allies, including many Arab states that are major players in U.S. policy and vital to U.S. leverage in the Middle East. There are also significant economic consequences. As you can see, there are 2 key choke points, the closure of which would have a profound effect on international shipping. The first is Bab el-Mandeb at the entrance of the Red Sea, down at the bottom. This is the area where Houthi fighters are firing missiles at cargo ships on their way to the Suez Canal. 22,000 ships normally transit the Red Sea, carrying 12% of global trade through Suez. More pointedly, it carries 16% of Europe's liquefied natural gas, used in Europe to replace Russian oil. To lose the ability to supply Europe's gas, and you may lose the leverage needed to support the Ukraine. Shipping in the Red Sea has dropped more than 30% since December, and with the recent attacks, I imagine it's plummeting. There are other routes. Tankers and dry cargo ships could go around the Horn of Africa, adding time and cost. But the Red Sea accounts for 30% of the world's container ship traffic. Rerouting container ships presents a larger problem, as they cannot transit Africa without reducing their loads. Thus, more ships are required and more costs are incurred. Since December, container volume through the Red Sea has dropped 70%. In a worst-case scenario, one analyst predicted that the ocean freight costs could go up 5 to 10 times. That's inflationary pressure that no country needs. The other major choke point is the Strait of Hormuz at the southern end of the Persian Gulf, through which transits 20% of the world's oil and 20% of the world's liquid natural gas. This strait is bounded on one side by Iran and has been the scene of many shipping incidents, including the attack on the USS Cole in 2000. The Hamas attack on Israel has done what Hamas meant it to do. It has reinforced attention on Palestinian statehood and restored the vitality of the Iranian axis of resistance. For an American public that was tired of being the world's policeman, it has put us back in uniform. The death and destruction in Gaza has ended the normalization of relations between Israel and its Arab neighbors and has severely strained U.S.-Israeli relations. A permanent ceasefire seems to depend upon conflicting demands by the combatants and their various supporters. The U.S. and Arab states want a 2-state solution that involves moderate governance. The Palestinians want a sovereign state governed by Palestinians. The Israelis demand security from Jordan to the sea and oppose an independent Palestinian state. To end the hostilities in Gaza, it seems, Israel and Hamas must negotiate to create a Palestinian state that excludes both Israel and Hamas. This is a big diplomatic problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. I took the liberty of putting in some links to some interesting articles. For instance, this New York Times interview with Thomas Friedman was really helpful.
First of all, let me just say it's a pleasure to be out west again, even if by Zoom. I was in a meeting last week on Ukraine. It went on for 3 hours and still left much unsaid and undiscussed. Let me see what I can do in 10 minutes or so. here we are in the situation we have. The Munich conference last weekend reflected this in spades. Today, what we face in Ukraine are uncertainties, and they dominate the outlook in Ukraine. There's been a substantial shift from the relative optimism at the beginning of 2023 to relative pessimism at the beginning of 2024. It's interesting that U.S. Western policies have created maximal stakes. We've called it critical to democracy, to world order, to security in Europe. What our policies are, U.S. policies and our allies, become critical, and they have profound reverberations in Europe and beyond. Right now, we're in a war of attrition along a 600-mile front. This is a rather fuzzy picture, but it gives the indication and impression of what's going on. Right now, Russia is pursuing a winter offensive, in particular at 5 different fronts and in other smaller areas as well, ranging from Crimea in the north to Bakhmut, who we all know about, which was lost, then Avdiivka, which was just lost last weekend. The fourth one, I can't quite even read it on my map. The bottom one, Robitin. Let me just mention a couple of things while we're looking at this map. If Russian success is better than they expected, it's likely that they will expand their goals. Right now, what they are trying to do is round out the districts that they occupied at the end of 2022 and annexed: Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. That's in addition, of course, to Crimea, which they annexed earlier. I'm afraid that if they have success in their current winter offensive, they may well want to expand their objectives beyond that and move as far as they can toward Kharkiv, which is hazy in this map. It's up in the upper left corner, which is the second largest city in Ukraine, or was. Much of the population has gone. And then down at the bottom in Robitin, the center of the Ukraine summer offensive in 2023. And it was the one area where they gained a certain salient. And right now, what Russia is doing is pushing very hard to retake that salient. They have the Ukrainian troops largely surrounded there, and so they may well succeed. Ukraine itself is dealing with shortages of ammunition, weapons. It's forced to preserve its strength. And right now, their emphasis is on establishing and reinforcing defense. There's been a relative failure of sanctions as well against Russia. You can see that imports to Russia by countries from China and India have grown dramatically. They, of course, have dropped off from the European Union, Japan, and UK. But this illustrates the change and the lack of success, how they have bypassed the sanctions. In the meantime, Russian economic and industrial resilience has been surprising. They have a growing economy predicted for 2024. Their defense production is at a height, and they're investing huge amounts of money into it. The one bright spot in all of this has been Ukraine's success in the Black Sea, where they have sunk some 20 combat ships and damaged a number of others. They've basically driven the Russian Navy out of Sevastopol, and they've secured the shipping lanes in the western Black Sea, which opens the way for exports from Odessa and other ports. Well, let me touch on 3 things in the time we have. The 3 key issues that I wanted to address are strategy in the face of stalemate, the support for Ukraine, and then talk briefly about settlement. How does this end? I would say, in terms of the strategy in the face of stalemate, the time is not on Ukraine's side. The former strategy, if you want to call it that, of as long as it takes, is really untenable. And we need a stronger strategy that moves from defense to offense as soon as possible. There's really no other solution which will allow Ukraine success in all of this. The question is whether there's any plausible strategy to gain an upper hand with Russia. It depends on equipment, training, mobilization, force size, and finally, and importantly, morale. A strategy could have these elements: strengthen defense in 2024. That's the most that Ukraine can do right now, I would think, and prepare for another offense in 2025. For that, you need more artillery, air defenses, armor, air power, long-range strike assets, training, and advanced technology. You've got to continue to control the Black Sea as much as possible. You can continue to squeeze Crimea with long-range attacks and special forces. And then the added thing is to strike Russia itself with drones, special forces, long-range missiles, and those including U.S.-provided attack systems. For this to work, the U.S. will need to relax its restriction about using U.S. systems to attack Russian territory. Now, we're left with the question, can Ukraine expect to take all of the Ukraine territory that's currently occupied? That's a very difficult proposition. Most people doubt it, even though this is Zelensky's stated goal. In any case, whatever is done with the new strategy, the aim is to strengthen Ukraine's hand in what will be a likely eventual negotiation. Then let me just touch very quickly on the issue of morale. That's going to be critical. Right now, Ukraine troops are suffering a serious decline in morale. This is affecting the civilian population. And the earlier sense of confidence that Ukraine could win has been replaced by a creeping resignation to really a perpetual threat. And the question is for Ukraine and for the West, for the United States, is whether this can be surmounted. The most crucial question is continuation of U.S. support. I think we all know what's been going on in Congress. That support is in question. If that support ends, the repercussions will be extensive and potentially decisive. The end of material and financial U.S. support would put Ukraine in an untenable military position. The political impact in Ukraine would be profound, demoralizing its leaders and citizens alike, and U.S. credibility and leadership would be shaken in Europe and beyond. It's unlikely that European allies could take up the slack because they lack the defense industrial base to substantially boost arms production, even though they're moving strongly now in that direction. And finally, it would be a setback for NATO because NATO has been intrinsic to the policies so far. Finally, I guess one can't fail to note but that the U.S. election in 2024 creates uncertainties for 2025. This again was hugely manifested in the Munich conference last weekend. I have a feeling that in the broad support for Ukraine that exists in the U.S. may, in due course, permit funding to prevail in Congress. And this would carry Ukraine through 2024. It'll be critical in combination with EU support. They recently approved $54 billion in financial support that extends over 4 years. And there are other important initiatives underway to enhance Ukraine defense industrial base. What more could be done, especially by partnerships with US and European defense industries? All right, let me touch very briefly on how this ends, the settlement. With rare exceptions, wars end in some form of negotiations. There are exceptions. World War II was one. You could even say the first Gulf War is an exception. There are three forms of negotiations one can think about: a ceasefire, an armistice, which is in one form or another a more formally established ceasefire, or some kind of broad settlement that deals with all of the issues involved. None of these are necessarily permanent, and some can be intrinsically unstable, especially ceasefires. Recall the Minsk agreements in the separatist part of Ukraine between 2014 and 2022. Even though there were principle of ceasefire in place, some 14,000 people were killed during that period. The likelihood of any negotiation will depend on the fortunes on the battlefield, but it will also depend on political developments in Russia and Ukraine. That will play an important role. In the interview that Putin had with Tucker Carlson, he offered to negotiate with the US. That's a very mixed thing. It's clear that his intention would be to create division between Zelensky and the allies. And this would certainly happen if the US went off on its own in discussions with the Russian. One wrinkle that could be considered in this is the use of a mediator. This could hold more potential than direct negotiations, but it could vary. Zelensky, interestingly, has been more open to the use of a mediator. Let me be quick. The interesting case of the Chinese proposal at the end of 2022, in the contrast to the US disparagement toward that proposal, Zelensky said, wait a minute, let's think about this. And he, in fact, pursued contacts with China. And there are overlaps between the Chinese 12-point plan and Zelensky's 12-point plan, which has been the center of his peace approach. Well, recently, China has been reticent, that perhaps due to Russia pressure. I wouldn't be surprised if Russia said to the Chinese, look, let's back off of this. This is not going to help us. Other than that, Zelensky has also promoted a series of 3 international conferences with a large number of attenders, most recently on the fringes of the Davos meeting, to rally support for Zelensky's peace plan. Russia has not been invited to these. Let me add one other thing on security guarantees. This is essential for Ukraine and certainly to provoke Russian opposition. There are 2 forms of security guarantees. These are bilateral commitments, military, economic, and financial, long-term guarantees by US and European allies. And the second is NATO membership. The NATO membership is the long shot. and it was waffled at the NATO summit last summer. I think this is going to be a critical issue at the NATO summit in July in Washington. There will need to be taken a clear position, I think, about NATO membership for Ukraine. Any such guarantees like this, though, will be essential to guarantee Ukrainian security and prosperity into the future. Let me just say one very quick word on this. Part of this is going to have to do with messaging with Russia. It will involve assurances to Russia in some form if we ever engage them in negotiations. We are compelled to think about what kind of incentives can be provided to Russia. All of this will be blended over into larger issues of European security. These are things that have to be thought about, and it also will critically depend on who is in control in Russia. If there's a variation in that, that could change things dramatically. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. When I was having the discussion with Keith and Ray and John about topics that had to be covered, I said, we can't leave out the southern border crisis. They thoroughly agreed, and they told me I got to do it. As we know, the southern border crisis is substantial. And this is illustrative. These are passports that are dumped at one of the choke points of people crossing the border, and they're from all over the world. As you've probably been following and you heard in many news broadcasts, December 2023 ended with more migrant encounters at the U.S.-Mexican border than any month on record. We hit essentially 250,000 in the month of December. This chart just gives you an idea of the crossings over time, and you can see a substantial jump. We had close to that number in March of 2000, but we're breaking records now on a regular basis. Contrary to some of the things that have been reported in the news, the majority of these crossings are people traveling in families. There's very few single adults and very few unaccompanied minors. So the majority of people that are coming across the border right now, or at least have been in this most recent wave, are traveling in families. That complicates the whole processing issues of the southern border as to how we handle them, whether they're separated, all of those issues that we've been going through for several years. So who's crossing? And this is, I think, a really important point to understand how the demographics is shifting in the crossings. Historically, meaning up until probably the last couple of years, almost all the encounters were either from Mexico or from the Northern Triangle region. El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and Mexico. And that accounted for almost all of the crossings. That changed recently. In December of 23, over half, so 54%, were from countries outside of Mexico and the Northern Triangle. In particular, 47,000 of that 250,000 that crossed in December were from Venezuela. It had been 6,000 in December of 22. There's been a sharp increase in encounters with citizens from China. 6,000 of that 250,000 in December. That was up from under 1,000 a year ago. The interesting thing is the demographic. These are people who are coming in who actually have money, have education, and they're escaping the economic situation in China. And these are people who, in many cases, have connections or have families in the United States. That also puts pressure on us as to how we deal with it. But the United States is not alone. Global migration is increasing substantially. And the two big things that we notice in that is the change in demographics as to who's moving. So we're seeing an increase in the demographics and migration. Obviously, there's conflict-driven, which just pushes everybody to go somewhere else. And the other is climate change. The pressures that people are under in certain areas felt substantially in Europe with the pressures of migration out of Africa because of extended droughts, floods, inability to grow crops, all of those things. We're starting to see a global migration pattern. The United States is part of that. As I used to say, and when I was in Homeland Security, if you're trying to solve the problem at the border, you've lost the war. You have to go back and understand what the sources are and what the causes are that are driving people to move, whether it's conflict, whether it's drought, whether it's failed governments, All of these things are driving people to move. And you can do all you want to close the southern border. You may win a battle or two, but you will have lost the war. We have to be able to stop the problem before it gets to the southern border. With that, that is our World War I tour. So I am going to jump into some questions that we have online. Biden just appointed Tracy Ann Jacobson as ambassador to Iraq. She was the State Department's director of the Afghanistan Task Force, which presided over the catastrophic withdrawal of U.S. forces. What does this tell us about Biden's plan for the U.S. fight against ISIS and the protection of the Kurds in Iraq? John, can you take that question?
The only thought I could say is that the current issue going on right now in Iraq, as I've understood it, is the question of U.S. troops that are currently in Iraq. When we took out the terrorist leader a week ago, 2 weeks ago, in the city of Baghdad, this had a considerable backlash, from what I understand. There is a live issue as to whether the Iraqi government can continue to allow U.S. troops to operate there. That would, of course, affect the situation with the Kurds in the north.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that. Why don't you take this question about Ukraine? Did we, the United States, did we miss an opportunity to provide weapons in a timely manner as requested by Ukraine? And is that the underlying cause of the current stalemate?
One thing we can say is it's certainly part of the cause of the current stalemate. It has to be noted that U.S. policy from February 22, when the Russians began their large invasion, we were very cautious over time in what we would provide the Ukrainians, all out of a concern about a risk of agitating the Russians. My own thought is that we paid too much attention to that. We allowed ourselves to be deterred by Putin's nuclear threats. I think we read too much into that, and that we should have taken a much stronger position on the weapons that we could have provided to Ukraine. Part of that restriction applied to the use of U.S. systems, whether missiles or any other form, against Russian territory. When you take that position, you in effect leave Russian territory as a sanctuary, and that's territory from which they have launched many of their strikes, continuing strikes, against Ukraine. And that simply doesn't make sense. As we go forward, the U.S. is not only going to need to provide better weapons, including long-range TACMs, the F-16s, but they're not going to arrive until this summer. And we should lift our hold on allowing Ukraine to use those weapons on Russian territory. I understand the risks, but I think we should do it.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that, Keith.
I agree that we could be a lot less anxious in trying to provide help to the Ukraine. I simply want to caution that whatever you think should be the maximum pace at which we supported the Ukraine, you should remember that we simply can't get weapons to them that quickly. You may recall that last year, the free world ran out of artillery ammunition. We couldn't find it anywhere. And we finally had to ship them cluster munitions because we didn't have any more rounds. So it's one thing to say, yes, we should have helped them quicker. Yes, we should have helped them. But there's another side of this, and that's the supply side. That can't be done very quickly. And Europe was not prepared to help. And in fact, if you recall the German tanks, they all had to be repaired before they were sent to the Ukraine. So this is not as easy as it sounds.
I'm going to ask Ray to take another question, if you would. It's about Hamas's complicity in using civilians as a human shield. How come there isn't more focused outrage about their inability to protect their own people in addition to what Israel is doing?
That's actually at the heart of a lot of the impasse between Hamas and the Israelis. The whole Hamas strategy was that the Israelis simply could not kill that many people to get at the Hamas fighters. I would say they miscalculated because I guess Prime Minister Netanyahu is quite willing to do that, and in fact has wiped out most of the active Hamas battalions and is now headed for Rafah. But for the world at large, what they see is the huge suffering, bombing attacks, it's the destroyed hospitals that have to be shut down and so forth. And it's a real conundrum. And you would have to say, if you were a strategist, that this is asymmetric warfare and that Hamas has played it with the only advantage they have, and that is to strike and then hide behind the population, hoping that Western values will keep the Israelis from following and destroying them. And it's working. What you see in the press is pretty much one-sided. It is people driven by the horrific losses of life and of families and of property and so forth in Gaza. You know, it's easy to forget that there are 1,200 Israelis slaughtered that set this off when there's 28,000 Palestinians who have been killed since this began. It is, for Hamas, a very effective strategy, and it's worked very well. Don't ask me which side to choose, because they're both wrong and they're both right.
Following on that, what are your thoughts about having Russia serve as a negotiator in the potential Israel-Hamas negotiations?
Certainly, China and Russia under Putin and Xi have been moving, and this is another subject we have on our list, of creating a new world order and excluding the U.S. China moved in very quickly in the war in Ukraine, trying to offer a peace proposal, trying to get the attention and undercut any U.S. effort to be a mediator because we've been so close to Israel. What about Russia? They might, but I think they might encourage China to play that role and support them from the rear, because they are working together to undercut U.S. influence around the world. I wouldn't trust Russia because their interests are not our interests. All we can do is lose on that account. So I don't see that that's anything we can encourage. China might be a little more doable. They're a little more neutral than Russia, but not much.
Following on that, John, in the situation in Ukraine, Russia may need assurances. That kind of goes against a lot of our grain when Russia invaded another country, and then we need to give them assurances to stop doing something awful that they started. But given all that, what assurances do we give Russia potentially, or would Zelensky give Russia potentially in a negotiated settlement?
Russia's and Putin now, as the leader of Russia, they're not worried about a threat from Zelensky and Ukraine. In any negotiation that involved a settlement of any serious kind, not just a ceasefire now, but something more serious, built into any sort of settlement would be the idea that the parties to the settlement will not threaten each other. And that has to go both ways. It's very difficult under the current Russian leadership and pursuant to the kind of narrative that they follow right now, which calls for the elimination as a nation of Ukraine, or at minimum, the creation of a Ukraine that's essentially subservient to Russia. It's very hard to picture what kind of assurances we could give. In a legitimate and genuine negotiation, all parties need to have assurances. And as leverage with Russia, there are things that we can do. You can mess around with the sanctions. You can work on border situations. You can basically provide the basis for a more peaceful and prosperous relationship between Ukraine and Russia and between the West and Russia.
Keith.
Look at this map. Look how NATO has expanded east to the Russian border since the collapse of the USSR. The one piece that's missing in that is Ukraine. We say, well, it wasn't our fault. We tried to promise the Russians in the 90s, and you have to see this context historically, that NATO would not move eastward. Yes, but did you ask those countries who live on the Russian border what their desires are? They came running to NATO. Please come and protect us from the bear. We've lived under the thumb of the Russians in the Russian Empire, under the Soviet Union. We want to have some assurance that we've got security. And of course, Article 5 of the NATO treaty gives them that security. So they came running to NATO. So it's not as if we were pushing them that way. We certainly didn't say no to them. But from the Russian perspective, they are paranoid, and they have good historical reasons for being paranoid. Attack from the West, attack from the East, okay? So if you're going to give them any type of guarantees, given the situation that now exists with NATO basically on their border, it's hard to know what we could do. We tried in the early 90s to have a European security conference, including Russia? How can we have a broader Europe that's at peace with itself? It never worked, and I don't think the Russians really wanted it anyway. Yeltsin was playing all kinds of games with us. I don't know that there's any assurance we can give to the Russians because they see NATO as a threat. And you can't roll the history back and take NATO away from those countries because they're scared to death of what's going to happen to them is what happened to Ukraine.
One of the reasons that Russia has opposed NATO expansion is not because they were fearful of a military threat from NATO. As a practical matter, NATO would be incapable of launching a military attack against Russia. Russia's problem with NATO expansion is that it reduces their freedom of action in that part of the world.
Thank you, John. Ray, you want one last word?
I agree with these comments that the Russians are pushing to reestablish their authority over what they call the near abroad. Those adjacent countries used to be under the sway of the Soviet Union. I think that we can have economic relations, we can have political relations, but we're not ever going to have security relations on the terms that the Russians would like to have them.
Thank you. Okay, I get the message here. I have a whole bunch of questions about the southern border. I'm going to get the right speakers here. That tells me we clearly need a program on the southern border and how to deal with those issues. So I hear you loud and clear. I thank our speakers very much, Ray, Keith, and John. Thank you very much. It was wonderful to see everybody on this beautiful sunny day, and I look forward to seeing you again in a few weeks.